Well, the most striking thing about Lincoln, for my money, is the psychological wholeness and maturity and balance that Lincoln managed to achieve. That he went through an incredible ordeal, a great deal of adversity growing up, and he overcame it to become the most balanced and the most psychologically sound president in American history. And without that psychological balance, I don't think he could have led the North to victory in the war. And I think all of us can take inspiration from Lincoln. Traditionally, it's been thought that Lincoln is an inspiration only for people who were born into abject poverty, and he was, that they could overcome poverty and they can become a successful lawyer as Lincoln was, a successful political figure as Lincoln was, or even a world historical figure as Lincoln was. But I think that in addition to people who were born into economic poverty, people who suffer from economic poverty, from emotional poverty, can also benefit from his example. Because he loses his mother when he's 9, which is very hard. His father's very unsympathetic figure, very estranged from his father. He has 2 siblings. One dies in infancy, and the other dies in childbirth when Lincoln is as a teenager. So death, early death, all around him. Then he has a marriage which is filled with woe, a very difficult marriage. He suffers from career setbacks. He tries to win election to the legislature and fails. Then he tries to win election to Congress and fails. Then he tries to win election to the Senate and fails. Now, he does succeed eventually, of course. But he overcame all that and then had a very difficult midlife crisis. He was prone to depression on 2 occasions. Lincoln was so depressed that his friends feared that he would commit suicide. And he loses 2 of his 4 children before they reach adulthood. And so he has a tremendous amount of emotional baggage. And yet he overcomes it to become psychologically whole and mature and balanced. And I think that he can be an inspiration for everybody who's ever had to struggle with any kind of emotional problems. So that's one of the things that I find most fascinating about Lincoln. I became interested in Lincoln partly because I grew up in Washington, D.C. And I saw the Lincoln Memorial regularly on Ford's Theater and the Capitol and the White House, and I had picnics at the Manassas battlefield regularly. So I think that predisposed me to be interested in Lincoln. And then my great-grandfather's cousin was Anson Burlingame, and he was Lincoln's ambassador to China, so there was a slight connection there. But the most important thing that predisposed me to be a Lincoln scholar was the fact that as a freshman at college, I had a charismatic teacher, a gentleman named David Herbert Donald, a very eminent historian of the Civil War, an eminent Lincolnian. And he took me under his wing. He made me his research assistant. And if he had been a medieval historian, I might be writing about the Middle Ages today. So I think that was the most significant single influence. Well, there are several parallels between President Obama and President Lincoln. They're both tall, skinny lawyers from Illinois. They both served 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature. They both served briefly in the U.S. Congress. Lincoln was a representative in the lower chamber for 2 years, and Obama was a senator in the upper chamber for 4 years. They're both gifted writers. Obama, when he announced his presidential campaign, did so on the steps of the old state capitol in Springfield, where Lincoln was served as a legislator and where he delivered his famous House divided speech. When President Obama traveled to be inaugurated in Washington earlier this year, he followed the train route that President Lincoln had taken. When he was inaugurated, he used the same Bible that Lincoln swore on when he was inaugurated back in 1861. And one of the striking parallels in American history, striking dates in American history, striking coincidence, is that President Obama was inaugurated in the year 2009, which is the 200th birthday of Abraham Lincoln. That's really extraordinary that the first black president would be inaugurated in the anniversary of the man who issued the 200th birthday of the man who issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which, by the way, is here on my tie. So there are a number of parallels. There's one major difference, however, and that is that when President Lincoln served, he was primarily a war president. The Civil War was the overwhelming preoccupation of President Lincoln. Now, President Obama, to be sure, has wars on his plate with Afghanistan and Iraq. but they're not the overwhelming demand that the Civil War was on Lincoln's time. And the closer parallel between what President Obama faces today and a previous American president is, of course, Franklin Roosevelt. When Franklin Roosevelt comes into office in 1933, the United States faces a terrible economic recession, depression. And President Obama's main concern has to be closer to what President Roosevelt faced rather than President Lincoln. But another parallel, the very eminent American literary critic Edmund Wilson once wrote that the example of President Lincoln is unparalleled. He's the only president who probably could have made a living as a writer. Well, I think if Edmund Wilson were alive today, he might add a name to that list, and President Obama would be that name. Well, the most important legacy that I think Lincoln has left that's parallel to our own time, that's useful for our own time, is the challenge to democracy. What Lincoln regarded the Civil War as was a war to vindicate democracy. That the Southern Rebellion was, in effect, an attempt to repudiate elections. Lincoln had won the election. The South said, we don't like the result of the election and we're going to break up the government. And Lincoln viewed the war not just as a war to save the Union, or later a war to abolish slavery, but as a war to vindicate democracy. That if the United States as a democracy, which was the most advanced democracy by far in the world at the time, if it can't succeed against domestic threats of dissolution and secession, then that will go far to discredit the idea of democracy. That conservatives in Europe and elsewhere can say, well, you know, democracy is a good idea on paper and in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. Look at the United States. They tried to give common, ordinary people the right to vote and have a voice in their governance. And what happened? The government fell apart. And if we allow the common, ordinary people in our country to have a voice, our country will fall apart too. So Lincoln regarded the Civil War as a war to vindicate democracy. And I think in a way that's similar to what the Islamic radicals are opposing to us today, that what they dislike about the West, the United States in particular, well, there are a number of things, but democracy is one of them. The Sharia law has to obtain, not what laws the people want, but Sharia, God handed down centuries ago. And so what we're faced with is a challenge similar to what Lincoln faced, a war against people who are trying to overthrow democracy. And Lincoln, as a war leader, was very determined. Now, we tend to think of Lincoln as a very kindly gentleman, one who would bend over backwards to find reasons to pardon soldiers who were convicted of desertion and the like. He's very generous and very conciliatory and humorous and all that. That's true. But also, Lincoln was very determined to win that war. And if more troops were needed, they were called up. Even when it was unpopular. The war was becoming unpopular at one point. And the generals called for more troops, and he said, even though it may not be popular, it has to be done. We have to win this war. So I think that's perhaps the most significant parallel and lesson that might be drawn. Well, the projects that I'm working on now are to unearth new information about Lincoln and make it available to other scholars and students. And thanks to the internet, it can be made available online for people all around the world. And it may seem surprising, but there's a great deal of raw new information about Lincoln that I was amazed to discover myself. When I first started to work on Lincoln 25 years ago, I assumed, falsely as it turned out, that everything important about Lincoln, everything that he had said, everything he had written, everything that was said about him and his administration had long since been unearthed and published in book form or article form, and that there was nothing new to be found by grubbing about in manuscripts and newspapers and public records. But when I did start to examine those unpublished manuscripts and newspapers and public records, I discovered an amazing amount of new material. And there's still more to be unearthed, and those are my projects for the immediate future, to try to make available statements that were made by Lincoln during the Civil War, for example, to people who then told newspaper reporters about them. And you have to go through lots of newspapers to discover these, and I've already done some of that work, but that's another project. Then there are reminiscences of Lincoln by people who knew him, and many of these were collected in the late 19th century by early biographers, and an awful lot of that information is unpublished. I want to get it and make it available both in book form and in internet form so that future scholars and students can learn more about Lincoln.